Welcome to the Speexx Exchange podcast with your host, Donald Taylor. As a renowned learning and development industry expert, as well as chairman of the Learning and Performance Institute, Donald sits down with experts from around the globe to talk business communication, learning technology, language, digital transformation, and engaging, upskilling, and reskilling your organization. This podcast is brought to you by Speexx, the first intelligent language learning platform for the digital workplace. Listen in and you might learn a thing or two.
Hi, welcome to another Speexx Exchange podcast with me, Donald H. Taylor, and our guest on this episode is Steve Wheeler, Learning Innovations Consultant and formerly Associate Professor of Learning Technologies at Plymouth University. Title of today's episode is Connected Pedagogy, Learning and Teaching in the Digital Age. So we're going to solve basically a whole bunch of issues around technology, social connections between people, learning in the 20 to 30 minutes it takes us to get through this conversation. Steve, I've given our listeners a very brief job title of yours, but it hardly conveys where you're about. Please, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Tom. It's nice to be here. Hello, everyone. I guess for the last, 43 years, I've been involved in learning technology, even before it was called learning technology. Back then it was called media and audiovisual and educational technology. There's been a whole range of things that I've seen developing over the past 4 decades or more. And I was quite young when I started, as you would imagine. I was still a teenager, but I kind of fell into that role. And ever since then, I've been watching technology develop and pedagogy, as I call it, developing with it. Now, we're at the point now where I talk about connected pedagogy. And for me, pedagogy, the word comes from the ancient Greek, which means to lead someone to the point where they can learn. It doesn't mean teaching. It means to lead someone to the point where they can learn. And I think that's been my philosophy throughout my whole educational career. When I trained as a teacher in the late 80s, I think that was the big thing I wanted to do with my students, was not to teach them and not to instruct, but to actually create environments within which could optimize their learning.
All right, so we've been around, although people seeing you wouldn't believe this, for more than 4 decades in our field. And your sense of how people learn is very much associated with not instruction, but with putting people in the position where they can learn. Perhaps you lead them, perhaps they discover it for themselves. Let's talk about this theme of today's episode, connected pedagogy. What on earth does it mean? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. Can you boil it down to like 50 words? Then we can go into it in more detail. So in 50 words or fewer, what does it mean?
Well, okay, I gave a keynote speech last week at the Eden conference in Bruges, and my title of my keynote was called Connected Pedagogy. And what I tried to explain to people who were listening, and those online as well, was that in today's digital age, as we call it, we're replete with technology. People know how to use that technology intimately. They have their own personal devices they carry around with them. Why can we not leverage the power of that to help people to learn wherever and whenever they are? It doesn't matter about location anymore. It doesn't matter about time. All it matters is that individuals have their own pace, their own choice, and their own kind of locations in which they can learn. That, to me, is connected pedagogy. There's a whole lot more to it than that, but maybe we can elaborate on it as we go along.
Well, but look, firstly, it's more than 50 words. secondly, I'm not sure that there's a difference here, Steve, between what you've just described and just using technology to learn with. What's the connectedness? Why is that so important?
Okay, well, let me start by saying something that I said yesterday in a podcast I was doing for EADTU, the European Association for Distance Teaching Universities. What I talked to them about was, they were talking about blended learning. And I said, look, I don't think there is such a thing. I think we've always been doing it because ever since the age of the printing press, way back centuries ago, when people were able to take books out of the library that were no longer chained, they could do mobile learning. They could learn anytime and any place. But the thing was, were they able to open that book and have a conversation directly with the author or with other people that were reading it at the same time? No, they weren't. Today, we have the ability to do just that. We have the ability to read anything.
Steve, that's great. That's an overview of part of this idea of connected pedagogy, but where is the difference there between just regular learning tech? Where does the connectedness come into all this? Can you delve into it in more detail?
Well, I was giving a presentation yesterday online, and in it I was asked to talk about blended learning. And I said, I don't think blended learning actually exists. Not, or put it this way, it's a word we've given to something that has existed for centuries. You go back to the printing press, the Gutenberg press, where suddenly books were able to be mass-produced. They were more affordable. People could walk away with them instead of reading them in chained libraries. And that was the start of what I would call mobile learning, because you could learn anywhere, anytime, any place. You took the book with you. It was your mobile device, if you liked, of the time. But could those people, when they opened that book, talk directly to the author? Could they talk to other people who were reading it at the same time? The answer is no, they couldn't. It was a solitary way of learning. Whereas connected learning in today's digital age means that we can open a digital book, or we can go online, we can read anything, and we can have instant conversations, not just with other people who are reading it, but also with the authors and with the experts behind those ideas. And I think that's an incredibly powerful idea that we now have. That to me is connected pedagogy.
Right. So the key thing is that we have connections with other people. Why is that so important? It's a compelling case, and I can see it. But give us some examples. Why is it so important that people are connected? What do they get out of that?
Well, firstly, anybody who is human, and I'm assuming that both you and I are human, because that's the race we belong to. The point about being human is that you are a social being. You're a social animal. You crave company. You crave somebody to talk to, or somebody to share your ideas with, to complain to celebrate with, to warn and to argue with. There's a whole range of things we do as humans that are locked into this idea of being in the social. I became a psychologist when I studied back in the early 90s. I've done 3 degrees in psychology, and during that time, what I've been noticing more and more is that we are increasingly social in what we do. As we get older, we tend to connect with people of like minds, and I suppose in a way that's exactly what social media and social networking does for us. So I think that's the big reason why we need to use these tools today, and why so many people are hooked into those tools today. You go where your friends are. That's the whole point, I think, about being online.
All right, well, I'm going to come back to that in a second, because I think there's an issue around that potentially. I'm not trying to give you a hard time, Steve. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this. But let's look at this. Does connected pedagogy therefore rely on technology? Could it not exist without the internet or the World Wide Web?
I'm not sure whether it could exist, but we've got mobile phones, we've got satellite networks as well. We've got a whole range of telecommunications that we've had with us for quite some time, and they're getting more and more sophisticated all the time. So nowadays, you can have asynchronous communication. What we're doing now is possible through technology. We could also do it through a telephone. That's technology too. Or we could write to each other, which is still technology. But each of those have different affordances to them. Each of those allow us to do different things. They have different nuances. And so therefore, they have different contexts and different meaning. And I think people adapt to the technologies of the day and leverage them to the best of their abilities. So I think the answer to the question is all connected learning and all connected pedagogy relies, I think, heavily on technology, whether it's correspondence courses through to video conferencing.
Well, perhaps we could say it doesn't necessarily depend on it, because you can always learn from the people physically around you.
That's if the people around you are expert enough for you to learn from them.
Well, that's what I was going to add on. I was going to say that you are therefore limited if you're only dealing with the people around you. The wider your circle, and the faster the communication, the richer, potentially, the depth of information you can reach and breadth of interpretation around it, depending on how good the people are who know things in your network. And I guess that's where the technology comes in, yeah?
Oh, yeah. And not only does the technology connect, it also amplifies as well. It gives more depth and more breadth to what you're learning, and the ability to share that and to build upon that learning in different ways. I think that that was one of the things that I talked about when Twitter first came out. I did several workshops in major conferences on the use of Twitter right at the start when I first adopted it in 2007, I think it was when it came out. And at the time I was talking about Twitter and retweets in particular, not just being repetition, but being amplification, because what you're doing is tapping into exponential networks of people who have followers that you don't have. And if they retweet it, or if they rebroadcast or share or whatever, then what you're doing is amplifying the ideas and adding value to them.
Let's talk about amplification for a second, Steve. You mentioned earlier the idea that you go where your friends are, and when I've heard you, I heard your talk that you did in Bruges, and you mentioned the idea of tribes, digital tribes. So positive news is get people together and they can really focus on something and they can really get to the bottom of it, like minds dwelling on and getting to the nub of a problem. Downside of that, what about the possibility of groupthink and people ignoring, because of confirmation bias, stuff from outside their group, outside their tribe? Talk me through that.
Well, the simple answer to that is that there are many tribes, and you can become parts of different tribes simultaneously. And what happens, I think, in this kind of anthropological kind of explanation I'm trying to give here about the way we group together and conglomerate together in different online settings, is that I can become a member of the Wikipedian tribe and also the Facebooker tribe, and maybe, I don't know, the Flickrites as well at the same time. And what I'm doing there is I'm doing three different things at the same time. I'm creating text-based and I don't know, media-based content in one. The second one, I'm actually connecting with friends and colleagues that I know and can interact with and share things with. And in the third one, I'm gathering around an image to discuss it. So what each one has different rules or kind of acceptable behaviors, and also maybe some taboos around them as well, which you have to learn. So in effect, you are a multi-tribe member. And the point about that is that, yes, there is confirmation bias by becoming a part of these tribes, because you're attracted to them, obviously, because you are members of like minds. But when you go onto somewhere like Twitter, it becomes less of an echo chamber, because what you're doing then is that you're seeing, obviously people coming into the discussion who are disagreeing with you or maybe challenging what you're talking about. And I think that's quite healthy. It gets unhealthy when people start to troll each other and start the ad hominem attacks and so on. But I think if we can avoid those kind of issues and discuss things in a healthy manner and argue in a healthy manner, then I think we learn an incredible amount more. And that's where the real amplification of ideas takes place.
Okay, there's a lot there, and we don't have time to dwell on the whole idea of social media and the pros and cons and the issues around polarization in particular, and how things work on social media. But there's one question that comes out of that straight away for me, which is, are we simply, with the word connected pedagogy, sticking a new label on what we used to call plain old-fashioned social learning until a couple of years ago?
Well, social learning has a number of different meanings to it.
Yes, okay, true. You're very well positioned to take us through what that might mean for different people, Steve. Could you tell us about different meanings of that phrase, social learning?
Well, if we look back at the work of Vygotsky back in the 1920s, then you'll see that Vygotsky espoused this idea of constructing meaning through connecting with each other in a social way. So the zone of proximal development, for instance, very basic theory of education, where you are in a position to expand what you can do with somebody else, which you couldn't do on your own. So you'd be limited in what you learn on your own, but with an expert or another person next to you, or in this case, technology next to you, you can learn a lot more. So your zone of learning is extended beyond what you can do on your own. That's the power of social learning in the sense that that we talk about now. But that can be done, as you say, in a classroom. It can be done in a lecture room or in a computer suite or whatever. But that's expensive today. Although lots of large organizations are still doing this, several now significantly are moving away from that to more, I suppose, what you would call learning at the point of delivery, at the point of need, the just in time and the just enough and the just for me type of learning.
And also, we should mention, I guess, that people have looked at and considered observational and social learning in other theoretical ways, Bandura, for example, and of course there's quite a lot of work done on social learning in animals, in primates as well, and we'll put some notes on that into the session notes so people can pick up on other links that if they're interested in following it. So let's move that forward then. We've got people, they're gathering together, they're learning from each other in a way that is new. What about the stuff that isn't available on network? And what I'm thinking about here is we tend to talk a lot about how, and I talk about this myself, there's a vast amount of information available. You mentioned at the beginning the idea of libraries having chained books. I went to a grammar school, it was founded in the 16th century, and it literally had a chained library. We had a regular library as well, but you literally could see what it was like. Now, we've moved from that position where information was largely captured in books until just a couple of decades ago, and other media, but largely books, to where with your phone you can, or any other device, access a vast amount of information, but it's not all information. There's stuff in people's heads, there's stuff that's private, either on paper or elsewhere, or captured inside organizations, which precisely because information outside in the public domain has become commoditized, that private information becomes much more valuable. So if the connections are so important, how does that leave us in respect of information that we can't access via a network?
Well, I think some companies are quite protective of their ideas and their products. Unsurprisingly, because that's how they make their living. So that's not going to happen, is it? Unless you're a great on espionage, industrial espionage. but the point is that you're making a really important point here. That actually, there's a lot of information out there that you just cannot get hold of. I talked about ungoogleable questions. There are certain things that you cannot even search for. And people who are listening to this now might be racking their brains over that, but there are lots of things, if you think about it, that we cannot search for.
Well, give us an example of an ungoogleable question.
Well, the one I gave at the conference last week was one I spoke to some anatomy and physiology specialists about, and they were doubtful that there were such things. And I said, well, what is there exactly 5 of in the human body? And they said, well, that's easy, 5 fingers. I said, no, come on, there are 8 fingers, 10 digits, but, what is there 5 of? And so they guessed again, they said senses. I said, no, actually, there's about 32 senses that have been identified, human senses. So they were starting then to get a bit irked with me, and they started Googling it, and they couldn't find what there was exactly 5 of in the normal, healthy human body. And so these are national experts in AMP, anatomy and physiology. And so I was on a winner then, of course. And so I said to them, look, it's quite simple. The thing is that there are 5 lobes of the lung. There's 3 on one side, 2 on the other. We're asymmetric. And I said, but that's not important. The important thing is, once you've found that out, that's a gateway question into deeper forms of learning. Because then you have to say, okay, why are we asymmetric? And they said, well, that's easy. It's because the heart is slightly inclined to the left. And I said, okay, so why is the heart slightly inclined to the left? And so the question goes why, all the way down through the depths of learning. And ultimately, because you don't know something, it intrigues you to go and find out what it is, and then it gives you a kind of an impetus to delve deeper into the deeper meaning of life, the universe, and everything. So for me, that's why it's important that we know that we don't know. It's a metacognitive skill, really, that we know that we don't know certain things. And as you get more and more wise and more knowledgeable around the world, the more you know that you don't know. And I've always said this, that universities and schools in particular are places you should go to find out things that you can't be taught.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. But hang on, but to come back to the original point here, but we get back to this point of distributed, I was going to say distributed cognition, sorry, I mean connected pedagogy. To come back to this point of connected pedagogy, if you've got stuff that you can't know without, for example, going to university to discover that stuff, does that put a natural limit on what you can do with connected pedagogy, that there are some things you simply won't be able to learn through this medium?
No, I think I think it puts you in a different position, a position where if you're open to new forms of learning, then you'll find people to connect with who can tell you things that you don't know. And I've done that ever since social media came along. I'm sure everyone else has who's listening to this. There are always things that you can learn that you never knew the day before by simply going online and talking to people, whether it's on Reddit or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, LinkedIn. All of these tools are available, and there are literally thousands of people there who are much more knowledgeable than you are. And it's simply a matter of connecting with them, really.
So what we're saying is that not all the information that's out there explicitly realized in a form, let's say, online. However, because you can reach the people, then you can get to the information. I buy that. All right. Steve, I would say that a lot of people are already perhaps unwittingly engaged in connected pedagogy. They're out doing it. They're walking around with their phones. They're connecting with people. They're learning stuff all the time. It happens to me every day. Is this idea of connected pedagogy more of a challenge for workplace learning or for the educational system in your mind, or is it a challenge for everybody?
It depends on the leadership of organizations or schools. I think all large organizations like schools, universities, and businesses that are multinational businesses, etc., they all have the same problem, and that is trying to adopt new ideas and to get the inhabitants of that organization to adopt those new ideas. And leadership is really important here. If the leadership isn't interested in moving forward, then the organization tends not to, or it tends to move forward very slowly. So selling an idea like connected learning, connected pedagogy, whatever we want to call it, into a large organization relies on firstly good leadership, vision, if you like, from the leadership, but secondly on certain early adopters, champions, if you will, within the organization who can help espouse that and help promote that amongst their colleagues and peers. And I think that, to me, Everett Rogers said this back in the 50s, didn't he? The early adopters are usually the opinion leaders, and they're the ones that, or often, if they are, if you've got both the opinion leader and the early adopter together, then you're going to see exponential growth and adoption of ideas.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on the spread of ideas in learning technologies at the moment, and you're absolutely right. The Everett Rogers adoption of innovation curve is absolutely crucial. Originally, of course, it was innovation in corn seed. A lot of people don't realise.
That's right. In Iowa.
In Iowa, yeah. And he went off and just spent a lot of time talking to farmers about why they chose to adopt new types of corn seed. Okay, but I think people are more receptive to this idea. I think generally people are more receptive to this idea in the workplace than they probably are in the educational system. But that's speculative. Let's not worry about exactly if there's a greater chance of adoption one place or another. Let me ask you, what do you think are the ways in which people will succeed in adopting a more connected pedagogical approach? What does it require, as well as the influences that you're talking about here? Are there technical requirements? Are there changes in habits of people? Or are people already doing it, and we just have to recognize that and support them in doing it?
Well, lots of questions there. I think I'll try and unpick that if I can. I gave a presentation at Learning Technology several years ago, and you might even have been in the audience. I can't remember, but what I said there was that there's always someone in every organization that's doing things different, and often they are doing things in a way that would be frowned upon by the leadership or the management of an organization. These people are what I call positive deviants. They do things in a different way. They may subvert or try and get around the rules because they know the rules are preventing them from doing something which is new and innovative. But go alongside those people and watch them and learn from them and then copy them if you can, because positive deviancy, I think, is really important as a means of finding change in large organizations and actually making it more adoptable on a widespread basis. I write about this in the new book I brought out, Digital Learning in Organizations, which came out in April this year. And I've got a whole chapter, in fact, 2 chapters dedicated to it, really. The idea of disruptive forms of innovation, where we see organizations starting to struggle with inertia, and then something comes along and pushes them forward. But the rate of that forward impetus is is constrained by the amount of people that will adopt that new idea.
I like the idea of the positive deviance and people. There being people out there who are already doing it, and I'm convinced that in any organisation, the people listening to this podcast will largely be people in workplace learning. I'm convinced that in any organisation, you will go out and you will find people engaged in this in your organisation. They may be doing it effectively, they may also be doing it slightly ineffectively, and I think it's important to, would you say, Steve, important to observe how they're doing it, see what works and what's not working?
I think this is the whole point of the social learning is that people can stand alongside you and say, that's really brilliant. Never thought of doing that before, but have you considered ... And this is where the connectedness improves the product. This is what I think James Sirowecki calls the wisdom of crowds, which goes back to the work of Francis Galton back in the 17th century. I think really, the idea of, it's not necessarily so much the smartness of the whole crowd itself, it's more the smartness of individuals within the crowd, which is propagated across the crowd, and then the crowd can actually refine that further and make it more adaptable or more creative or more effective or whatever. So I think this is the whole point of being connected, is the refining of ideas.
You said this before, it's not the wisdom of the crowd en masse, but the individuals and the rapid sharing of the best quality information. That always is true, provided, of course, that people talk in a collegiate, responsible way, coming back to this business of not beating up and trolling people. So is part of setting up a effective, connected, pedagogical approach in your organisation, is part of it supporting a nourishing, nurturing culture for sharing?
I think so. I think we have to have an open learning culture within effective organizations. To make them effective, it has to be open forms of learning that is welcomed, especially informal types of learning which is done because the colleague wants to do it rather than because they have to do it. Compliance training is fine, but there is so much more learning that can be done in organizations that doesn't get covered by that. And often it's learning that isn't kind of anticipated to be needed. So someone may come up against a brand new problem that never existed before because of a new technique or a new method of production or whatever, and nobody has the answer to it within the organization. What happens then? So, so this kind of learning, I think, is increasingly going to be required, and it's going to be increasingly powerful as well because of the technology that we're using.
Steve, that's great. Before we wrap up, and I'll ask you the two questions we ask all of our interviewees. Do you have any case studies, any simple practical examples that don't have to be grand, of where you can say, look, this is where this idea of connected pedagogy has had a clear impact? Any thoughts to share on that one? When
I was still lecturing undergrads at the university at Plymouth, which I did for 20 years, one of the things I used to do was have a second screen to the left of me. My screen to the right was slides and other images and things. To the left, I had a live Twitter feed, and all of my students would be kind of encouraged to be on Twitter. And I would use a hashtag for each session, which was unique to that session. So they would lock into that hashtag, and I'd have it on the screen in front of me, and they could ask questions during the session, and we could all discuss together and check and so on. And I remember talking about one of the books that I recommended as set reading for my students, and 2 or 3 of them were discussing it at the back, and they were putting it onto Twitter. And I thought, I wonder, and I actually, this is a true story, I actually retweeted it, knowing full well that the author of the book is a friend of mine and lives in America and is a top professor over there. And within about 20 minutes, he was answering live on the screen, and their faces when they saw that, they couldn't believe it. They asked me if that was the real, person. And, yes, it is him. And so they all started engaging with him. And he answered. He's a brilliant. What he did was he answered their questions, several of them, and got them really enthused. And they all went off and read the book. To me, that is opening up the walls of traditional learning environments and creating a crowdsourced, connected, networked type of learning approach where anybody can contribute and anybody can learn from everyone else.
That is a really lovely example. Thank you, Steve. I'm sure they were all very excited to have access to that. It's what the internet gives us, or rather, it's what the World Wide Web gives us, which is this access to world-leading specialists from anywhere in the world, provided, of course, that we have the, if you like, the key to the door, which is very often trust. If we can open the door to access to them and they can trust us, we can have a conversation, which is marvelous. And some, of course, are more trusting than others. Steve, we ask all interviewees 2 questions when they come on the Speexx Exchange podcast. The questions are, number 1, what do you wish you'd known when you'd started in learning and development? Steve.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a really interesting. I think I have to kind of go back to my early years when I was scared of everyone. As a young teenager and an early 20s guy in the field, it was very fast moving, very rapid, lots of big names in the field. And I think I was just about scared of everyone. But now I realize that actually we're all in this together. None of us should be scared of each other because after all, there's no us and them really. We're all looking for the same things. We all need the same things in life. We're all human. We all cut when we're cut, we all bleed. Yeah. Our hopes and fears are all the same. And I think we're all looking for the same thing ultimately.
So you wish you'd perhaps felt more, had permission to I don't know, contact people a bit easier or perhaps trust yourself a bit more?
I think if I'd have realized that I shouldn't have been afraid of anyone, I think I'd have had much deeper conversations with people. Today I find myself in a position where I'm afraid of no one, not even you, and and I can have conversations. I'll just go up to anyone and talk if I have something to say or something to ask. And I think putting your hand up and asking a question. There's no such thing as stupid questions. There are stupid answers, but there are no such things as stupid questions. If you don't know, ask. And take the courage to look a fool for a minute rather than be a fool for your whole life. I
love the idea, but Steve, obviously I am a very far from fearsome person, as you know. Steve, also, second question we ask, what are you curious about right now in workplace learning? What are you really curious about?
I suppose I'm curious about the relevance or the continuing relevance of training rooms in organizations. I was having a conversation with someone this morning. He said he went into a big organization last week, of which the workforce is largely between 18 and 35 years old. And he said, and what they did for 90% of their training time was classroom-based stuff. And I was amazed at that, to think that in the 21st century, well, 2 decades into the 21st century, we're still doing chalk and talk, or the equivalent in organizations. There are lots of other options. And so that intrigues me, is the longevity of the traditional learning space within organizations.
I'd love to know everybody what they think. If they're listening to this, does the classroom have a role in the future? I mean, it probably does, but it's a very expensive resource. We should never forget that. Steve, look, it's been great to have you on the Speexx Exchange podcast, talking about connected pedagogy. Obviously, in the show notes, we will have a link to your blog where you talk about Bruges. You talked about your book, Digital Learning in Organizations. We'll have a link through to that. Great to have you here, Steve. I'm sure you'll be back in the future. But for now, Steve Wheeler, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. It's a real pleasure.